Hello, everyone. As you may recall at our last board meeting, we had discussion about shifting our organization to the servant leadership model. And we discussed some potential concerns that I had and agreed that I should look into it further and present my findings at today's meeting. And this presentation is intended to do that, and I've entitled it Reforming the Brookshore Industries Culture. The purpose of this briefing is to advocate for a well-rounded, evidence-based approach to reforming the Brookshore Industries culture. Core to this presentation will be a comparison of the article that we looked at last week related to servant leadership, as well as an additional article that I uncovered through a systematic search of the literature. And that will be the basis for our discussion going forward. But first, let's go over the overall agenda. Today, we will discuss the appropriateness of an evidence-based approach. We'll discuss an evidence-based decision framework, look at hierarchy of literary evidence, outline guidelines for reviewing literature. Then we'll take a closer look at the Melchar and Bosco study from last week, discuss the additional alternative document that I mentioned, and from there uh, conclude with a recommended course of action for the board to take. The argument for an evidence-based approach may seem like common sense, but it's worth repeating here. To make good quality decisions, we need to use our critical thinking skills with the best available evidence. And there are multiple sources of evidence in addition to literature. We also have the organization, what is Brookshore Industries all about? Our data, facts, figures, policies, practices, our culture. That's a source of evidence. Our practitioner, professional experience and judgment. Stakeholder values that include the values of our employees, the leadership team, as well as customers and other organizations and entities that we interact with. And then, of course, what's available in our scholarly and gray literature. By gray literature, we mean industry industry-related publications that may not necessarily go through a peer review process, but are still informative to our decisions. From these multiple perspectives and multiple trusted sources, we can put together a good case for what we should do and make decisions about courses of action. So the general evidence-based decision framework is really quite simple at a high level. Uh, 3 steps: gather evidence and collace the evidence. And evidence includes multiple things, and I've highlighted literature here since we'll be using that as an example going forward. And then from that coalesced evidence, come up with a good quality decision. Now, when we think about literature as evidence, it's important to note that there's a general hierarchy of literature, scholarly literature, that we should be aware of. The hierarchy isn't perfect, and of course, it depends on the quality of the study itself. But in general, there's a pyramid, if you will, of quality of evidence within the studies, with the lowest level of evidence being expert opinion or an editorial, and the highest level being a systematic review. And there's also a risk of bias, which is higher at the studies that are towards the bottom of the pyramid and lower as you get to the top of the pyramid. So as I mentioned, in addition to the general hierarchy, we also have to consider the actual quality of the individual study or the individual article that we're analyzing and considering for evidence. And there are various guidelines for reviewing literature. And in the example that I'm providing here, evaluated studies, including the article from last week, using the checklist for assessing technical quality of quantitative descriptive studies. And what this checklist and other checklists like it provide is a consistency of the review process. And you can use it to summarize the strengths and weaknesses of individual articles and studies. And in general, it contains a comprehensive criteria to evaluate the study design and the data quality and method of analysis and how the findings and conclusions all relate to each other. Let's take a closer look at the Melchar and Bosco study that we discussed last week. First, looking at the graphic on the right, highlighted that the article is a cross-sectional study or survey that fits in the mid-range of the hierarchical pyramid. And when we take a closer look using the checklist, there's two significant concerns that come out among others, but I will just focus on the two that are most critical for this group. And both are constructive criticisms of the research. The first one is that the research design does not support the stated purpose of the study. In the abstract, the authors state this empirical paper investigates whether a servant leader can develop a corporate culture that attracts or develops other servant leaders. And on page 4, they state the study examines whether the incorporation of servant leadership at the strategic management levels of an organization engenders a culture of servant leadership at lower levels of management. These two statements convey the purpose of the study and imply a cause and effect relationship between the application of servant leadership practices and the resultant effect on employees. However, the study design does not incorporate a time-related before and after component or a side-by-side comparison of various leadership styles. Rather, the study is a descriptive analysis of the current state of 3 car dealerships. And so the study does not meet the criteria of the checklist as the strategy does not meet the study's aims. The second criticism is that the conclusions do not follow from the findings. And let me explain that a little bit further. There are a few conclusions, and the first one is that the servant leader model offers a positive alternative to other leadership theories. This doesn't hold because no alternative theories were measured or analyzed. In fact, the servant leadership factors were compared to an apparently arbitrary threshold value of 2.5 on a scale. The second conclusion, the ability to measure the constructs of this theory consistently among organizational contexts is seen through this current study, is not clear and is difficult to understand what the authors meant by this. For example, an explanation of the phrase consistently among organizational contexts would be helpful. And the third conclusion, clearly servant leaders can be successful in a competitive for-profit service organization, isn't clear based on an analysis of 3 dealerships. And this conclusion, that is success, is not or does not relate to the purpose or findings of the study. So the study violates another important criteria on the checklist in that the conclusions are not supported by a reasonable interpretation of the findings. So the bottom line of all this is that use of this study as a source of evidence may lead to suboptimal decision making. Let's take a look at an additional piece of evidence. I did a search on the benefits of servant leadership and just plain servant leadership from an online library and selected 4 candidate articles and then did an additional analysis and ended up selecting one article by Paris and Peaching 2013, which is a systematic literature review. And as you look at the graphic on the right-hand side, you see the Paris and Peachy article fits in the highest category in the hierarchy of literature. And doing an analysis of this article and an evaluation of it using the checklist criteria, the article is strong in all of the assessment criteria, which is a good sign. And some particular highlights include that this study included empirical studies that investigated servant leadership in an organizational context and excluded studies that were primarily focused on model development or development of measurement instruments. And the sample included 11 qualitative studies, 27 quantitative studies, and 1 mixed method studies. So approximately 40 studies were combined and evaluated in this one article. In the quality assessment, the authors identified 22 studies that were classified as high quality, 12 as medium, and 5 as low. And through this analysis of the studies, they came away with an overall conclusion that servant leadership is viable and valuable on an individual and organization level, which can lead to increased overall effectiveness of individuals and teams. And in fact, the findings that they uncovered were applicable or are applicable in a variety of cultures and contexts and organizational settings. So in general, this particular article is a strong reference and strong source of evidence to include as part of our decision making. From these 2 examples, we can see that the quality of evidence in the literature does vary and that there's a lot more evidence out there to take a look at in the literature, as well as additional perspectives and evidence from our organization and practitioners and stakeholders. And so as part of our course of action, the recommendation is to gather this evidence into a comprehensive and diverse assessment so that we can use the combined evidence to make a decision about the future direction of the Brookshire Industries organizational culture. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to discuss further.